Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting momentarily. Just going to wait for everyone to file in from the waiting room. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We will get started momentarily. How exciting. All right, well, I will start talking. So my name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring tonight's event. And I'd also like to thank the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover for partnering with us and helping us promote this event. This event is part of a series of Black History Month programs that both libraries are running this month. And we're also associated with let me get this right, Libraries Working Towards Social Justice Collaborative, which is headed by the Memorial Hall Library in Andover. So we thank in particular the Stevens Memorial Library tonight, and we thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for funding. Before we get started, a few things just to set expectations. I anticipate the program lasting approximately an hour. We're using Zoom webinar tonight, so neither Jane or myself can see or hear the audience. So if the audience wants to ask a question or make a comment, you're going to do that through the chat box and through the Q&A box. And we will address the questions at the very end of the presentation. I am recording the presentation tonight, but again, only Jane and her PowerPoint will be captured by the video. No one in the audience can be seen. Everyone on the call tonight will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please fill out that survey. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events here at the library. And I think that just about does it. So as an icebreaker, for those who are comfortable doing so, don't feel obligated. But if you'd like, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from tonight. So if you're comfortable doing so, let us know in the chat what city or town you're watching from. That's always fun. And I think I have the settings so that you cannot see other people's chats or other people's questions. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm still kind of working out this whole Zoom webinar thing. But wonderful. Thank you all so much. We have several from out of town, several from out of state, even someone from outside the country. How about that? That's wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I am not going to preview any upcoming programs, but in the email I send out tomorrow, there'll be a long list of all the Black History Month programs we're running in February, and you can take a look at those then. So let me get to the good stuff now and introduce Jane. Tonight's presentation is entitled African Americans as Subjects and Creators in American Art. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This program examines that arc as it relates to African American history enshrined in American art. From colonial era portraits to 19th century and Jim Crow era prints to 1960s civil rights photography, art educator Jane O'Neill, owner of Culturally Curious, will provide a visual overview of African American oppression, struggle, and progress towards equality. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designated Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art, And again, tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and presented in collaboration with libraries working towards social justice, and in particular, our partner for tonight, the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. So all of us live here on Zoom, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us here tonight. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was very nice. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I am honored that you chose to spend your evening with me and thinking about this topic. So we will be delving into masterworks from the history of American art, a few lesser known works along the way. But our focus, of course, tonight is on African American artists and also how African Americans have been depicted over the years. So a pretty tight focus. We could certainly turn this into a semester long course if we wanted to, but we have but an hour together. So I'll dive right in. Ooh, I just realized I'm at the way end of this presentation. So close your eyes for a moment. This is all just a preview. Okay, here we go. So we'll start off with the quote that is part of tonight's program title. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that's attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but he sort of took a piece of it from a Unitarian minister from the 1800s. The gist of it, though, is this idea that even though progress can be frustratingly slow sometimes, we are all heading in the right direction. And for the most part, we are heading towards a more just, more equal world. And it's a very hopeful quote. It's a wonderful quote. And I wanted to start off on a hopeful note too. This is, I would say about half of the program is looking at art from the 19th century that's by white artists for the most part. And so that might seem like the longer part of the arc and it might be frustrating. But then we'll see sort of the shorter part of the arc, the more recent time, which I think can be really invigorating and can fill you with a sense of hope. So a quick preamble, and that is I am personally really passionate about African American history, and in particular the component of African American history that sort of holds the best and most beautiful ideals of this country, holds them, almost puts them to the test, and I love to see when those ideals are tested and they are proven solid. So that's all just sort of pacing along that arc. So without any more ado, let me just give you a sense of how we'll move through the material. First, we'll be looking at, as I said, images primarily by white artists of African American subjects, and that will be late 1800s into well into the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, we'll be looking at African American artists, first around the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and then post civil rights era. So responding to history, I think, will be a really sort of fascinating look back at sort of where African American artists have been. All right, so let's dive in. So, subject and subjugation. Whenever we're thinking about not controlling the way one is represented to the world, there is a power dynamic there, and that's just added to the additional layer of the black white power dynamic that has long existed in this country. So it makes sense to sort of start off with an image of one of our founding fathers. And of course, we're looking at George Washington here, depicted with his family, his wife Martha, and her two grandchildren from a previous marriage that were raised as their children. You'll notice there are several images or several symbols here that speak to the Washington's power and to America's rising power. We have a globe over here that the boy rests his hand on. You'll notice there are no countries on this globe. It just sort of is there to reference a kind of rising global significance. And then the map on the table is a map of Washington, D.C. And I think Martha is either pointing to where the White House is going to be or where the National Mall is going to be. So it's really sort of, laying out uh, visually their significance to the country and to the world. And so, of course, you can't talk about these things without noticing the gentleman standing on the right in this picture. And it's interesting because the scholarship has changed over the years in terms of looking at him and addressing him as a subject. But before I get into that scholarship, I just wanted to quickly note that this picture is in the National Gallery of Art. It was painted around 1796, and it took the artist Edward Savage about 7 years to complete because he was moving back and forth from New York to Philadelphia in order to capture, to sit with each subject in this portrait and to capture their exact likeness. The picture itself is monumental in scale. The figures are practically life size. At one point, he took this canvas all the way across the ocean to London with him. And at that point, he decided the picture needed some sort of Virginian flair to reference George Washington's identity as a plantation owner. So that's when the artist Edward Savage decided to include an African American figure on the right. And while he was in London, he used an available model, a young boy. And so you can see from the X-ray here that the young boy would have stood a little bit shorter than the figure that is there now. You can see his nose, his profile here, his eye would have come just above where that lapel fold is. So eventually he brings this canvas back to the United States, and he paints over this figure of the boy with this specific figure here. And um, and from what we know, this is almost certainly George Washington's personal valet, a man by the name of William Lee, also called Billy Lee. And we know that George Washington had a long relationship with this man. He was his valet for about 20 years. And by all accounts, he sort of matched him in terms of how physically impressive he was in terms of, riding and fox hunting and all of that sort of thing. And the scholarship on this is kind of fascinating because for many years, he's not really talked about. Then, when he is acknowledged, even the National Gallery refers to him as being a servant, when, of course, because George Washington owned more than 100 slaves, he was enslaved. And then, and only in recent years, I would probably say within the past decade, language has been updated on the National Gallery's website to acknowledge the fact that he is a slave, and other scholars have sort of pinpointed his identity to be more specific. So it's important to note that William Lee is included in this picture in a really traditional way. That is going back centuries in the history of art. European artists have often included figures, African figures, on the sidelines of portraits of white figures in order to enhance the status of the white subject. So, in many cases, these Black figures can almost be seen as accessories to enhance status, to set in concrete their social role in the hierarchy of things. And so, going back to Washington's portrait here, that is very much the case of including William Lee in this portrait. So the next image that I wanted to show you from early America, and then we'll spend the rest of this section in the 19th century, is this work here. And since so many of us tonight are from the Boston area, this might be an image that's familiar to you because it's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. There are several other copies of this work at the National Gallery in DC and at the Detroit Institute of Art. This is John Singleton Copley's painting called Watson in the Shark, and it's from 1778. It's an incredible picture. John Singleton Copley, of course, is long associated with Boston. That's why you have Copley Square and the Copley Tea Stop. But in the second half of his career, he moved to London. And one of the individuals that he met while he was there was a man by the name of Brooke Watson, who we see in the water here. Brooke Watson grew up to be a successful merchant and a member of parliament, and then later the Lord Mayor of London. But when he was 14 years old, he was swimming in the harbor of Havana and was attacked by a shark who ripped off his leg below the knee. And of course, this is a traumatic event, that one that he sort of wore for the rest of his life because of his amputated limb. And it was one that Copley decided to immortalize with this picture. And in particular, he decides to immortalize the scene where Brooke Watson is saved. So there's themes of salvation sort of resonating here. It's sort of a religious picture in that way. But very importantly, we have sort of at the head of this triangle that's created by the figures in the boat, Brooke Watson and this monstrous shark in the water, we have at the head of that triangle the image of this Black man here. And I need to state very clearly that this is an unusual and a really sort of highly sensitively rendered image of a Black man from this time. It's unusual because they often weren't depicted in works of fine art by American artists. And if they were, oftentimes artists would use sort of negative racial stereotypes in order to depict them. So here we see a man who is concerned, compassionate, rendered as fully human as any other member of this boating party or this rescue party that he's a part of. And what's really important for us to remember is that he's not in the margins. This is very different from the Washington portrait that we just saw. He is essentially the head of this pyramid that is the entire composition for the scene. And even more importantly, take a look at this. What's in his hand? The rope that literally connects him to Brooke Watson. The Black man is the savior here. He's holding Brooke Watson's hand in his life, or life in his hands, I should say. So importantly here, John Singleton Copley did not originally conceive of this figure being a Black man. So this seems like a really important decision. An early sketch shows that this figure originally had long flowing hair, like the figure to the right here. So John Singleton Copley makes a really specific choice. And the result, I think, is very much a reflection on what else is happening in the world. We can make a lot of connections here. So I'm going to connect this to the idea that this is a picture of a Black man in a boat. And the strongest association in contemporary times of Black men in boats was the transportation of kidnapped, stolen slaves being brought, or Africans being brought as slaves to the New World. And London was an important port for the beginning of that triangular trade, sort of another triangle in addition to the one that we're looking at here. So ships would leave from London, go to Africa, and then transport human cargo across what's known as the Middle Passage to the New World, and then return to London. Brooke Watson, who we see here in the water, was in support of the system of slavery through his entire political career. So this isn't necessarily his salvation as a politician. What we do have, in addition to this, the kind of gruesome thought and image of people being chained inside these boats to capacity here and beyond, is imagining how awful that journey, that middle passage is. And there's another artist who depicted a particularly gruesome story that wasn't out of the norm for the time. This was painted several decades after Copley's picture, but this is another image from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, in this case by a British artist named J.M.W. Turner. And the picture here is of a slave ship that is heading into a typhoon. And in order to not lose money in terms of the insurance of their human cargo, who were dead and dying, they just dropped them still alive into the ocean. And so we can see, I'll zoom in here, shackled hands and feet, still trying to keep above water, while all of these fish and sort of monstrous, horrific looking shark type things are coming in for feeding frenzy. So it's a picture about man's inhumanity to man. And then we go back to Copley here, and we see that triangle that relationship has been shifted, and now the black man is in the boat and the white man is in the water, and the shark is still an ever-present threat. So it's impossible to say if Copley was trying to make a political statement with this work of art, but by making this very specific choice to make this figure black, I think he's forcing his viewers back then, and of course his viewers today, to consider the broader context, the broader relationship between African Americans and boats and sharks here. So we're going to switch gears, head into the 19th century, and move to dry land in America. And this next work that I'm going to show you is probably one of the only works in the whole presentation that I would not categorize as being a masterwork of American art. This is an image really that's only come to my attention in the past few years, and it's a strange one. It's in the collection of the Colonial Williamsburg. And so the front of this picture is a really unremarkable, I would almost say generic portrait of an unknown man, unknown white man. And then rotated and painted on the back of that portrait is this image here. And it's an image that shows us the brutality exacted upon African American slaves, Black slaves in the United States. And so we see a white man having sort of a sexual relationship with a Black woman, a Black slave, and then another white man who is about to physically abuse, physically beat a Black man. And then we have this really sort of grotesque title here, Virginian Luxuries. And so the fact that this is hidden on the back of a picture sort of suggests to me that this is sort of a secret, sort of a sick secret that somebody like perhaps the sitter here could kind of show and divulge to the right kind of guest who is visiting. But there's certainly a secretive aspect to this, and a really sort of brutal, horrific aspect to it. So this is just sort of something to keep in mind. It sort of sets the stage for what we understand the system of slavery to be in the United States. Most of the rest of the images that I'm going to show you don't depict it in such a frank way, I should say. A lot of the images that we're going to look at are very nuanced, but I think it's important to kind of start with something that shows it and keep that in mind too. So the next artist I wanted to show you was working in the 1830s to 1850s in Long Island, New York, and his name was William Sidney Mount. He's celebrated as America's first native-born genre painter. He painted scenes of everyday life, and he was living in New York at the time when, or I should say, after the time that slavery had been abolished there. And his pictures very frequently depict integrated scenes, people, Black and white people together, which is always kind of interesting and refreshing. And you look at them more carefully to see what these social dynamics look like. But I think it's important to note that William Sidney Mount himself was in favor of slavery. He was against the abolition of slavery. So that sort of colors some of these pictures in a certain way. So the image that we're looking at was painted in 1836. It's called Farmer's Nooning. So we're looking at an integrated scene of figures that are taking a break in the middle of the day. And originally, William Sidney Mount had intended the picture to really be about these three figures in the foreground. And then ultimately, as he continued to work on this, he realized that the way the sunlight hits this figure in the haystack, that the picture sort of becomes all about him. And it is, I mean, he's beautifully painted and your eye goes right to him. In some ways, this is a meditation on work and sort of the moral component of being sort of studious and dutiful. Because even though they're depicted as taking a break, you can see this figure over here on the left is still sharpening his scythe. Whereas the figure over here in the haystack is completely asleep. Um, there's no effort, there's no work that's being done here. I think that William Sidney Mount may have been thinking about the history of art when he created a work like this. And there's a particular sculpture from ancient Greece, a really famous sculpture that's known as the Barberini Faun. It dates to about 300 BC. And it's an iconic work because it shows us a sleeping figure. And this is the sort of international art symbol for being asleep, not being dead. Um, and this faun in particular is well known because this is a depiction of sort of uh, drunken, erotic sleep. I mean, it's a beautiful figure, but it is the furthest thing from rational thought that you can imagine. And what a figure to base an African American figure on. We do have a reference to perhaps being drunk. There's a jug here. There's a beauty to this figure that I think could be considered erotic. And then there's the suggestion that in terms of a work ethic, he is sort of a world away from this figure who's sharpening his scythe. So then to add insult to injury, he is being pestered. He's sort of the butt of a joke here because there's a white child who's tickling his ear with a little piece of straw. So this beautifully illuminated image with this gorgeous composition of like triangle within triangle within triangle is sort of this nuanced look at this kind of social hierarchy here and these racial stereotypes that persisted even after the abolition of slavery. William Sidney Mount's depiction sort of gained traction. And even about 15 years later, other genre artists, in this case, an artist named James Cloney, was recreating the joke, the punchline here, of course, the sleeping black man, and the sexual overtones are even copied here because he is sitting here next to oysters, which were considered an aphrodisiac. But he sleeps while he fishes, and then there's a white child tickling him with a piece of straw. So again, I think that there's something um, more sort of cutting and to the point with the second image that I'm showing you, but there's still several layers to unpack with both of these images. One other picture by William Sidney Mount that I wanted to show you, and of course, this is the title image that I use for this program. It's called The Power of Music. It dates to 1847, and again, the artist is William Sidney Mount. It's just undeniably a gorgeous image. And I think it was created to, on the one hand, kind of suggest a connection between all of these figures, but then to reinforce the separation. Because, of course, the power of music is pulling them all together in a certain way, or inspiring them, or uplifting them in a certain way. Everyone is focused on this fiddle music. And the white figures can look directly at it. They all occupy the same space within this barn. And then the black figure seems to be, just walking by, and he stops. He's arrested by the sound of this music and seemingly, sort of transported by it. I've zoomed in here just to show you these lovely details. I just love the way this picture is painted. The social status is certainly reinforced in this picture. And you have sort of well-to-do white men here, and then the black man's coat and pants are sort of a patchwork of fabrics. But he is, the artist here is imbuing this figure with real humanity. He's not relying on stereotypes per se, and I think it's really a stunning picture. I love the way the light sort of spills down on him, and how you have this barn door handle, which sort of seems to directly connect him to that music, even though there's nothing about him that crosses the line of that barn door. So, William Sidney Mount's pictures, there's a lot to unpack there. There's one other genre painter from the 19th century who very frequently depicted African Americans and African American life. And I think it's worth looking at a few of his images. So the artist here is Eastman Johnson, another white artist who took up the subject of African Americans. And the image that I have on the screen is called Negro Life in the South. It dates to 1859. It's also been known as Old Kentucky Home for a long time, but art historians have determined that this is set in Washington, D.C. So the Black figures that we are looking at here are, in fact, slaves. And what's really interesting about this work is that over the years, art historians have come up with completely polar opposite ways for interpreting this image. And and it's just interesting to know that you can look at the exact same set of information, the visuals here, and come 180 degrees away. So originally, this was considered to be a picture of happy slaves, that Eastman Johnson was giving us a really uncritical perspective of what slave life might have been like. We have a couple flirting, we have a man playing music, and we even have a woman and a child dancing. What's not to love about this, right? um, but in more recent years, you have art historians coming and looking back at this and thinking that there's a lot of symbols that are happening here, or a lot of symbols embedded in this picture, and really sort of subtle coding for us to take apart. And the predominant reading of this image is that it is an image about slave owners um, mixing, sexually abusing their Black female slaves and the resulting children from those relationships. So art historians would point your gaze at the skin tones in this picture, that they range from very dark to very light skin. Um, and they would also direct you to look at the fact that the slaves' quarters here, which are clearly dilapidated, are right next to a really nice structure here, which we can assume would be the slave owner's home. There's even a white woman who's walking into this area from that area. You can even see that there's a nice little garden up above her, but the space that the slaves are in is not it does not enjoy that same sort of cultivation. So, so you see a figure group like the one up here in the window, and we have a woman with a dark complexion, and her child seems to have a much lighter complexion. So there are other references here too to that sexual abuse that happened between slave owners and their female slaves. Art historians would point your attention to the fact that there is a ladder here connecting these two structures from upstairs. Um, Even though this isn't going from one window to the next, it's sort of that connection from upstairs life to upstairs life. And then we even have up in the tree a rooster sitting up here, and then a hen down here on the slaves' quarters. So it would seem that perhaps Eastman Johnson is giving us a very sort of nuanced view of those relationships without actually depicting the white slave owner who would have been at the center of those relationships. One other Eastman Johnson picture I wanted to show you, and every time I look at it, it just takes my breath away, is this one here. It's called A Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves from 1862. This is in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And what we're looking at here is a pre-dawn flight, a pre-dawn escape from slavery. And you can only imagine how terrifying that would be to try and run away from someone who has enslaved you. And note the year, it's 1862. It's in the middle of the Civil War. So this flight is across a Civil War battlefield. And if they can make it past the Union lines, then this family of four is free. We've got a little boy, a father, a mother, and a baby pressed to her breast. She's looking back, they're looking forward. Even the horse looks a little terrified. And just beyond him, you can see these little white streaks, which would be the bayonets of the Union Army. So it's this breathtaking um, act of bravery, of absolute courage to go on this ride and sacrifice everything for what could be everything. It's an amazing picture. And it's not only amazing in what it's conveying here, but how different it is from the material culture of this time. What we're looking at now are really sort of generic, run of the mill public advertisements for runaway slaves that you would see in all kinds of publications in the 1800s. And you'll notice that these runaway slaves are always depicted in this kind of visual shorthand, just a figure on the move, a figure with bent legs, essentially. And then there's a really sort of short verbal description of these figures. And neither the image nor the verbal description ever encapsulates a runaway slave's full humanity. And so this was what represented runaway slaves to most of the white population of America at the time. So Eastman Johnson's picture is brave in and of its own right too. All right. Our next image is one that might be familiar to those of you that are watching from in and around Boston. What we're looking at here is a sculpture that's known as the Emancipation Group or the Freedmen's Memorial. It's sculpted by an artist named Thomas Ball, and it was created in 1876. It's known as the Freedmen's Memorial because freed slaves raised the money to create it, to honor Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. And I want to show you a couple of other views of this image. Even after, right after it was unveiled, it got mixed reviews. Frederick Douglass actually wrote, "The Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, but not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." So there is something really problematic about depicting this figure, the figure of the slave that Abraham Lincoln is liberating here, depicting him nude, depicting him shackled. I think importantly, his head is raised and it looks like he's about to rise up. And I think that Thomas Ball was probably thinking of one of the most popular, most familiar images to come out of the abolitionist movement, which is this one here on the left, created by the British artist Josiah Wedgwood back in the 1700s. And so here we see a nearly naked Black man who's in chains on his knees, sort of pleading for the cause of his own humanity. And he says, the text here I think is so important: "Am I not a man and a brother?" Very compelling stuff. I mean, it reaches right into your heart, but we don't get quite the same effect with Thomas Ball's sculpture group. And so there was a copy of this same sculpture in Boston, and I believe it was taken down just this past December, because as we're in this national conversation about what are the monuments that represent us as a country, I think it had been pointed out again and again by different groups that this without context was sort of misleading. And so I think they're going to find a different and better home for it. All right. So one of the last few images from this section that I wanted to show you, I think we see sort of a turning tide with this image. I've always found it so fascinating. This is created by the American master Winslow Homer, and it's called A Visit from the Old Mistress. I even love the title there because the title immediately sort of places us almost in the shoes of the Black women in this picture, or as their allies in some way. Um, this was painted in 1876 and it's in the collection of the Smithsonian. So clearly, the relationship between these women has changed. And since the emancipation of slaves, these women are no longer owned by this white woman. And yet, here they are confronting each other, the white woman in their space, in their home. In prior to the abolition of slavery, I'm sure that all of these women had to stand, had to be on their feet when their white mistress entered the room. And this woman over on the left, she seems almost bored by the occasion. She remains seated. I'm always drawn to this figure here, this central figure, and the expression on her face, which I think can be read in so many different ways. Um, Defiant, frustrated, tired, but she looks directly at this woman. And I get this real sense that she's not prepared to sort of suffer any fools here. So what's interesting about this picture is that Winslow Homer is not, this is the situation the entire country was in at this point. You have freed slaves and you have white former slave owners. How do they interact and how do they move forward? And Winslow Homer doesn't give us that path forward in this picture. He just shows this very sort of tense interaction here. It's a really sort of smart, masterful work and still resonates very much so today. So the last image from this category, and it's sort of setting the stage for turning the page, is this one here. It's by uh, uh, an artist named Henry Tanner. It's painted in 1893, and the title here is The Banjo Lesson. Henry Tanner was a black painter, and in fact, he was like America's first black celebrity painter, probably by any measure the first successful black painter in America. And what he is doing with this image is really sort of working to defy and break down long held stereotypes about African Americans and banjo playing. These stereotypes and really sort of racist caricatures of Black people playing banjos go back a century, if not more. And they're disparaging, they're disgusting, and so when we finally have our first sort of really successful African American painter, he takes up the subject and he shows it in a completely different way. He gives us the full humanity of these figures. And he tells us that banjo playing isn't some sort of aspect of being Black that sort of comes naturally or anything like that. Instead, he's saying that this is wisdom that's passed down lovingly from one generation to the next. I love how the grandfather here holds. The end of the instrument up, sort of supporting its weight, and how, to me, I always read the expression on his face as though he's really carefully listening to the music, to the sound that the boy is creating by fingering those strings. They are in a rather austere setting. You don't get the sense that there's any sort of sense of wealth to their lives, but there is certainly kind of the wealth of this experience that's being handed down. So this is sort of the perfect precursor to what we're going to see in the 20th century. We're moving away from white artists who were solely sort of capable and responsible for depicting Black life, and we can see that that was handled in to varying degrees of success. But once we get into the 20th century, a generation or two after slavery, we see that African American artists or African Americans are really experiencing enough economic stability, some of them, to be able to study art, to exceed at art, and to be able to show the full vitality of African American existence. And so the artist here that I want to share with you is Archibald Motley. These are both works by this artist from the 1920s. And he's very closely associated with what's known as the Harlem Renaissance, which was primarily a movement that revolved around literature, but it also had dance and the visual arts components that were kind of wrapped into it. And it was essentially Black writers, dancers, visual artists who were celebrating Black life. So Archibald Motley had a formal training as an artist. He studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in this painting from 1924, he portrays his grandmother. And with just this kind of stunning realism and humanity, the way her face is painted is just incredible. I think almost anybody could look at that woman and sort of like be reminded of their own grandmother's face in some ways. It's so loving. Here she is mending socks. And in the there's beautiful still life behind her. And then, very importantly, he included on the edge of this picture a framed portrait of a white woman. And she is, in fact, the woman who his grandmother's mistress. She was a slave owner, and his grandmother had been a slave about 60 years earlier. So sort of enshrining an important piece of African American history there. As the 20s went on and into the 30s and 40s and 50s, we see that African American artists have a real interest in working in abstraction. So there's oftentimes a realistic element to their works, but they begin to abstract the figure more and more. So there's just 5 years between these works, but what we see is the figures rendered with a greater amount of simplicity here. And so gone are all those wrinkles and that sort of thing. And what Archibald Motley has offered up here is just like what looks to me like the greatest night out ever. Maybe I've just been, you know, home for too long in the age of COVID-19, but it's a great nightclub scene. We've got people dancing, and it almost seems like these instruments are like right in the middle of the dance floor. Like that trombone is actually going between the man and the woman as they dance. So there's this compressed space. There's all this wonderful energy and vitality. And that's a great connection to this next artist, whose name is William H. Johnson. These two works from his Jitterbug series are both in the collection of the Smithsonian. And we can see that William Johnson also really abstracts his figures and gives us this incredible sense of movement, of vitality, with the horns and the drum in the background. I mean, I can hear the music. I can picture the jitterbug happening. I just love these images. William Johnson had lived abroad for many years, and when he returned to the United States, he felt compelled really to share the history of African Americans in art, because he saw that it wasn't being shared in a meaningful way anywhere else. And it wasn't represented in art either up until this point. So in 1945, he created this portrayal of Harriet Tubman. It's a fantastic painting. And so, of course, as the leader of the Underground Railroad, she's this incredible heroine. She's represented standing here with clothes that sort of reference the American flag, and with a rifle. I mean, how often do you see a female heroine from American history armed? And then we have kind of a bust length portrait of her from later on in her life. We have what seems to me sort of like this barren landscape in the background, curiously, with like two suns and a star, which kind of represent, I think, the travels on the Underground Railroad, helping so many slaves escape to freedom, and perhaps these two different worlds along this divide. Um, so an incredible work. And there's a number of African American artists from the 30s through the 40s and 50s who are really interested in telling the story of African American history, but I think in part because that story hadn't been fully written or codified. What we oftentimes see are artists that render the figures in an abstract way. They're faceless, or they're not individualized. And so this artist in particular, whose name is Aaron Douglas, painted this panel from a series of 4 panels in 1934. And these images were created for the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. The series is called Aspects of Negro Life from Slavery to Reconstruction. So we have these incredible figures in silhouette that sort of speak to picking cotton, to religious worship. I see figures over here with their hands raised up in prayer or in praise. And then we even have an attack by the Ku Klux Klan happening over here on the left as they ride in. And you can see that they've knocked figures to the ground here. So by making these figures, by rendering them this abstractly, Aaron Douglas creates a history here that feels universal. These are stories that were shared by so many African Americans, and he enlivens the scene furthermore with these kind of abstract elements of these concentric circles that kind of cut up and divide the space. So really sort of powerful, interesting stuff here. And then the last artist from this section that I wanted to share with you is Jacob Lawrence, who in many ways was doing things that were sort of similar to Aaron Douglas. He's telling the history of African American life. And he's doing it by sharing sort of universal experiences as opposed to celebrating really specific people. And so he renders the figure um, very abstractly. And with an image like this, which is the first panel from his 60 painting series called the Migration series, he shows us that he has an incredible sense of color and composition. I just love the yellows and the peaches that sort of dot this composition as we see all of these African American figures who are sort of flooding into this train station, leaving southern plantations, heading up north to cities where there's greater opportunity. And the last Jacob Douglas or Jacob Jacob Lawrence image that I wanted to share with you is this one here. It's called The Library from 1967. And Jacob Lawrence frequently depicted libraries. He loved libraries in particular because that's where he learned about African American history. I think many of us today are feeling like we're still getting this history in little bits and pieces, particularly in the past year, as there's been so much consciousness raising. Can you imagine what it was like to live in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and know that there was this history out there, but that was not being shared, and you had to sort of dig to find it in the library? So Jacob Lawrence is showing the library as such a vital and resource. And we've got about 35 figures in this library with tiny figures in the background, children being led in classroom instruction, to figures who are doing research and studying carefully, a figure here who just seems to be reading over another figure's shoulder, and then people who are, discussing or seem to be discussing what they're reading together. So the library as an essential resource for learning African American history. And that history is so important as we head into this final section tonight. And I have to say, this last section always leaves me feeling very inspired and very invigorated, because the artists that we'll be considering are all African American artists, and they're responding to everything that we've seen so far. They're responding to the lack of representation. They're responding to the creativity of the Harlem Renaissance, and they're doing it in really smart, really brilliant ways. So, the first artist I want to introduce you to is an African American photojournalist by the name of Ernest Withers. This was painted. This photograph was taken in 1968, and this is the Memphis sanitation worker strike. It's such a moving image. I go back to this image in my head so often because it's um it's so striking. And so what we're seeing here are a line, or really a crowd, of African American men who are standing holding a sign, a simple placard that says, "I am a man." And even just reading that out loud, it just reaches into your heart, pulls at those heartstrings. It's a devastating message that anyone has to argue for their own humanity. And that always brings me back to those early abolitionist images, particularly the text there. I not a man and a brother? And of course, we've come a long way from a naked supplicant slave, and we have men who are standing with dignity here. Of course, the Memphis sanitation workers strike is what led Dr. Martin Luther King to Memphis, and unfortunately to his untimely death, his assassination at the Lorraine Motel. So the next image I wanted to show you, there's interestingly a lot of black and white images in this section. This is a work by an artist named Glenn Ligon, who does a lot of really interesting sort of meditations on African American history. And so, of course, what he's doing here is reflecting back on the material culture of the 1800s that referenced runaway slaves and the sort of visual and verbal shorthand that was used to describe Black people who ran away from slave owners. And so he does that. He uses both of those things to describe himself here, to create his own self portrait. And we can see by doing that how those old ads fall so short in terms of telling us anything about who these people were. So it's just a really sort of smart way to reflect back on that history and to represent it. Another work by Glenn Lagan, which I wanted to show you, and it's one that's near and dear to me because it's here in my hometown at the Currier Museum of Art. It's called The Invisible Man from 1991. Oh, I should mention that this other work that we just saw is called Runaways. It's part of a series from 1993. So we have The Invisible Man from 1991, and it's two panels, and you can see there's the same text on each panel, but it's sort of it doesn't occupy the same amount of space, but it is the same text, and it's the opening lines from Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man. And so the text here is sort of getting at this idea of feeling like a ghost, feeling like a specter, being ignored, being feeling unseen by American culture. And then you'll notice as you go along that the text becomes sort of muddy and hard to read. The letters sort of start bleeding into each other. And as you sort of zoom out, zoom back, and kind of do the magic eye thing with your eyes, you can see that that muddied text is giving us the silhouette of a figure, frontal and in profile. And so Glenn Lagan is again showing himself through this text. So erasing this idea of invisibility or playing with this idea of invisibility, because we certainly don't get a sense of what he really looks like in these images. And he represents it again as sort of um, as being almost similar to like mugshots, frontal, or oftentimes he actually took these pictures from behind, but also in profile, two images that would work together side by side. And so he's kind of talking about preconceived notions of African American men, a sense of invisibility here. It's really powerful stuff. And then you get to kind of dig through the text at the same time. The next artist I wanted to show you is also dealing with the subject of invisibility. We're looking at Fred Wilson's installation called Guarded View, also from 1991. Fred Wilson is an artist who, when he was in college, he served as a security guard in an art museum, and he had a lot of time to sort of think about this role of security guard. And so, with this installation, he is showing us four Black bodies, headless Black mannequins, and each one of them is dressed in a uniform, a guard's uniform from a major New York art museum. And so, what he's pointing out several things here that he began to ruminate on when he worked as a guard. This idea that in virtually every art museum, the most diverse staff is the security staff. They're also paid the least. They're also the people with the most important job, protecting the artwork. And they are also the people who are kind of most often ignored. They're the staff that people come into contact with most frequently. They're there in the galleries, but they are unseen. They are ignored, but their bodies are as much on display as any work of art in the galleries. So in some ways, Fred Wilson's installation here, it's almost functioning like the George Washington portrait that we started off with. It's, the body that's there, but is it, for all intents and purposes, almost invisible. This image on the right here, I pulled off of Twitter about a year ago because somebody was visiting the Whitney, and they certainly felt that that the guard in this case was sort of an extension of Fred Wilson's work of art. So I have a few images by female Black artists who are working today that I wanted to share with you. And so this is Lorna Simpson's work that's called 5 Day Forecast, also from 1991. There was something in the air in 1991, clearly. And so once again, we have headless bodies, in this case, a woman's body, and it in nearly identical poses, slightly different photographs, but only in that, the fabric of this kind of loose white shift that she's wearing is slightly more wrinkled, slightly more shadowed. In the place of where her head would be, there is a label of, each day of the week, Monday through Friday. And then below these images are the words misdescription, misinformation, misidentify, misdiagnose, misfunction, mistranscribe, misremember, misgauge, misconstrue, and mistranslate. So she's playing on the notion that we refer to women as Miss so and so, Miss Simpson, um, and also very clearly stating that she is someone who feels profoundly misunderstood, and so her 5 day forecast. She knows exactly what she's going to engage with each and every day. It is the same thing. It's the same sense of miscommunication and misunderstanding, which is she universalizes again by having it be a headless figure. All right. So one more artist who deals explicitly in or specifically, I should say, in black and white, and then we're going to see a lot of color. But I wanted to show you another female artist, and I would say these are the hardest images to look at in the whole program. This is a huge installation called the Slaughter of the Innocents. It's from 2016, and the artist here is Kara Walker, and she is a MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner. She's been working in this idiom in cutout silhouettes for decades. She originated on this concept, I think, around the early 1990s. And so in this case, it's a biblical subject, but she's essentially telling the story of African American life prior to the Civil War. And she is using the visual language of racial stereotypes too. So the image on the left is the type of thing that you would see as a part of the material culture of the 1800s, where African American physiognomy is dramatically exaggerated in order to continually oppress and suppress them. And so she's using that same language here, but interestingly, this black paper cutout is associated with silhouette portraiture, which is kind of like an upper class mode of portraiture. The images are violent, they're graphic, and in this case, with the slaughter of the innocents, we have this association with the sexual abuse of female slaves. So these are hard to look at, but remind us of the the truths, the very ugly truths of slavery. So the last two artists that we're going to look at, a lot of color, and I would say are engaged with the past, but also very much grounded in present day as well. So this artist is Kehinde Wiley, and he's like an art historian's dream because he loves to look at the history of art, and he likes to look at the way white men have been depicted as heroes, as men of action in the past. And with his works, he sort of points to the ways that African Americans, mostly men in particular, are essentially never depicted in a similar way. So here he puts a contemporary man on the back of a horse, just like Napoleon here in Jacques Louis David's painting from 1800. And Napoleon's rearing up on his horse. There's, a wind blowing his cape, and he looks like somebody that is worthy of our consideration as viewers. And Wiley, the artist here, is doing the same thing with his subject, who is appropriately wearing camo because, this is a military subject matter, but looks for all the world like somebody that you could run into at the store. So he's elevating this figure in so many ways, by incorporating him into these kind of art historical tropes. I even love this kind of rich, almost like damask background here, which again, Wiley loves these kind of dense patterns, but there's like a richness of this material that we don't often associate with, contemporary Black men. So just to give you a sense of the scale of this picture, it's epic. Here are a few more Wiley paintings in the background. It's in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and I remember for years it was in the lobby of the museum. And as you're going through the Rat's Maze to buy your ticket, you could just stare up at this huge painting, and I was just fascinated by it when I first saw it. I think it's an incredible work. Wiley, of course, painted Barack Obama's official portrait from 2018, and he shows us the former president seated, leaning forward, arms crossed, but looking out almost as though he's connecting with us, looking right into our eyes. And he seems to be enveloped by all of this greenery surrounding him, and there are flowers that are sort of embedded within this greenery, and all of these flowers have symbolic meaning. The yellow chrysanthemums are a reference to the president's time in law school in Chicago. There's jasmine in there, referencing his childhood in Hawaii. And then there's blue lilies, which reference his father being from Kenya. And apparently, Barack Obama was just really happy that Wiley didn't show him up, rearing up on the back of a horse or sitting on the back of a rearing horse. This somehow makes him a little bit more serious, perhaps. So, the last artist that we're going to consider is Titus Kaphar, and his work is seen here on the right. This is a work that is called Shifting Gaze from 2017. Kaphar is another MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner, and he does have a fascinating TED Talk if you're interested in following up on that. He essentially taught himself how to paint by going to art museums, and then he went on to get an MFA from Yale. And while he was visiting art museums, he saw a lot of images like the one that we see on the right, or sorry, on the left, where it's white figures that are accompanied by a black figure. And the way the painting is rendered, we know that the white figures are supposed to be the focus, and the black figure is an accessory, a seeming afterthought. And so what Kafar would do would he would repaint these pictures and then modify the paintings to focus our attention on the figures that have been marginalized in the past. So by essentially whiting out the white family here, the entire picture becomes about this boy, and I think he becomes this really compelling figure that we want to know more about, and that's exactly what Kafar is trying to do here. I mentioned that he went to Yale. This next work that we're looking at is actually inspired by a painting of the founder of Yale University. And in this painting, of course, there's another Black child who's included in the margin as a way to kind of prop up the social standing of the white men. Kafar has repainted that picture. He's crumpled it up, almost turning it into a work of sculpture. And then he adds a small frame to just frame out the face of this boy. And I love the title of this work too. It's called Enough About You. This is another great, really sort of brilliant way for him to point out uh, the the figures here that are worthy of our consideration, that are just as important as any other figure that's included here. So the last work by Kafar, the work that we'll sort of wrap up with tonight, is this one called Behind the Myth of Benevolence from 2014. And so what he's done here is he's taken a portrait of Thomas Jefferson that was painted in 1800 by Rembrandt Peale. and he's repainted it and then sort of loosened it from the frame of the canvas, again, sort of turning it into sculpture. And he sort of uses it as a curtain. And behind the curtain, he reveals the face and some of the body of a nude Black woman. And so he is reminding us that behind the sort of celebrated images of our forefathers, there is this kind of awful history. There's this legacy that's rarely talked about. It's literally behind the scenes, but it's as much a part of who they are as anything else. And by pulling the curtain back, he's literally showing us what that history is. And I think it's a really sort of compelling kind of update of that secretive picture that we saw to sort of start off the 1800s, where the abuses against Black people were kind of a secret that was hidden behind a picture. And Kafar is turning it all around, and he's showing us those secrets, having everyone confront those kind of awful truths. So to wrap up, I want to end on that hopeful note again, going back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote here: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So there is a very long history of white artists representing African Americans in awful and in graphic terms, or sometimes in sort of subtle language as well. But when you have a generation of artists like Glenn Ligon and Titus Kaphar, what's so great is that they're looking back at that history and they're drawing a direct line to present day and showing us, moving us further along this arc to a place that is more just and more equal for everyone. So I will end there, and I welcome any questions or comments that anybody has at this point, and I'll start checking out the chat as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. You did a wonderful job. Folks, we'll go another 5 or 10 minutes with questions. Jane, there's already a couple of questions. They're actually in the chat, not the Q&A. Bruce Bruce has a comment and a question. In literature, African-American writing is very well known in the American canon, but in the visual arts, particular painting, not so much. Do you have any insight into why that is?
That's a good question. Well, my initial hunch, my initial reaction is that perhaps it requires a different amount of training or different access to training, also materials. So I think that those could all present themselves as barriers in the process. Um, I'm sure that I, I would be doing a disservice to the material if I didn't say that there were some successful African American artists all along the 19th century. I mean, this was broad brushstrokes, to be sure. So I think where you could find examples of really compelling work from African American writers throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, you could probably find parallels in the visual arts. But I would say that having the training, having the materials would present themselves as barriers to access in the field for sure.
And then Maria says that she had to sign off about 5 minutes ago. She wanted to know if there's a recording of this program, and yes, I'll send the recording out tomorrow morning in the email. And she comments, "There's much to be said about visualization via art versus narratives. Viewing your artwork in this program was quite moving. Thank you very much."
Oh, thank you. I think, yeah, I mean, the artwork can be really, really compelling. And it's part of all of our shared history. So, so I'm really, again, sort of honored to have this opportunity, and I'm so pleased that everybody joined us tonight to reflect on this.
All right. Well, that's all I see for questions. We had a shy audience this evening, and that's fine. So, folks, want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Want to thank Jane for the wonderful presentation. Look for an email tomorrow morning with a feedback survey and also a link to the recording. And I think that'll just about do it. Jane, make sure to check the chat and see all the thank yous. And we'll wrap up there. So thank you all so much for joining us. And I will end the call in about 10 seconds. Thanks again.
Everybody. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Jane.